She had it all. The face, the curves, the laugh, the men. The world called her the dream of every man, the envy of every woman. But Marilyn Monroe was not a dream. She was a message, written in lipstick and pain. While cameras worshipped her every movement, no one noticed the trembling hands behind the pose. Behind the diamonds, behind the breathy giggle, there was a woman gasping for air, surrounded by scripts she didn't write, lovers she didn't choose, and a fame she couldn't escape. They said she died from sleeping pills. Others whispered of murder. Some believed she simply gave up. But what if the real truth is even darker? What if Hollywood, and the men who ran it, never intended for her to live too long? This is the untold story of Marilyn Monroe. She didn't just enter the screen, she melted into it. Blonde curls cascading like golden waterfalls, eyes that sparkled with danger and delight, lips that spoke of innocence and sin in the same breath. When Marilyn Monroe appeared, the world forgot its troubles, or at least pretended to. Born Norma Jeane Mortensen in 1926, she would become the most recognized woman on Earth under a name that was never hers to begin with. Marilyn Monroe. Two words that would become both blessing and curse. In the 1950s, she was America's sweetheart, a walking paradox of seduction and softness. Films like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, The 7-Year Itch, and Some Like It Hot didn't just make her a star, they made her mythology. She wasn't cast in roles. She was the role, the dumb blonde who was far smarter than she let on, the woman every man wanted and no man could truly keep. Magazine covers adored her. Soldiers painted her on the noses of warplanes. Women envied her wardrobe, her figure, her impossible balance of childlike laughter and adult allure. She became the very definition of sex symbol, but not the modern kind. Marilyn's allure wasn't vulgar. It was weaponized vulnerability. She drew you in not by how much she revealed, but by how much she seemed to hide. To the public, she was luminous, literally. Cinematographers designed new lighting just to capture the way her skin glowed on film. Directors waited hours for her to appear on set, and forgave her every time when she did. Breathy, magnetic, fragile. Her presence was oxygen. But underneath the dazzle, something else simmered. Marilyn Monroe wasn't a person. She was a performance. A well-rehearsed act in high heels, constructed by studios, managers, photographers, and an entire culture of male expectation. She wore the label of sex goddess, like a corset, beautiful to the eye, but painfully tight. When she walked into a room, the atmosphere shifted. She became the center of gravity. But gravity, as we know, is a force that pulls and eventually breaks. She joked that she could walk through New York City unnoticed as Norma Jeane, but when she turned on Marilyn, crowds would swarm. That wasn't magic. That was a mask. And yet, the public never questioned it. They didn't want depth. They wanted desire. They didn't want truth. They wanted a poster. To the world, she was an eternal fantasy, frozen in a subway breeze with her white dress fluttering and a mischievous smile playing on her lips. That image, that moment, would become immortal. But it wasn't her. It was an echo. A version of her sculpted in studio boardrooms, repackaged for every man's wall, every woman's mirror, and every gossip column's headline. And she played along. Because she had no choice. Behind the glitz, behind the Oscar parties and the Kennedy rumors, Marilyn was fighting battles no one could see. But those weren't part of the story America was sold. The real woman, the real Norma Jeane, was edited out. Because in Hollywood, the dream must be perfect. And Marilyn Monroe, for all her light, was becoming too real. Before the diamonds, before the fame, before she became the fantasy, there was just a little girl named Norma Jeane. And Norma Jeane was afraid of the dark. She was born in Los Angeles, 1926, into a world already unraveling. Her mother, Gladys, was emotionally unstable, struggling with paranoid schizophrenia long before anyone had the words to diagnose it. Her father? A blank space. Officially unknown. Biographers still debate who he was. Some say he died early. Others claim he denied her. But what's certain is this. Norma Jeane never knew a father's love, only the echo of absence. When she was just a baby, her mother handed her over to foster care. It wasn't out of cruelty, it was survival. Gladys couldn't cope. So Norma Jeane was shuffled between homes, foster parents, and institutions like a package no one wanted to sign for. One home was with the Bolenders, a strict religious couple who believed laughter was sinful and mirrors were tools of vanity. Another was an orphanage, where cold sheets and locked doors became her lullabies. By age 9, Norma Jeane had already learned two things: that love was conditional, and that beauty was currency. She was abused, perhaps by a boarder, perhaps by a relative. The records are vague. The silence is telling. What remains is Marilyn's own later admission that she was molested as a child. That behind her pouty lips and flirtatious eyes lived a girl who had learned too early how men could look at her and what they might take. In those days, she escaped into the movies. She would sit in dark theaters for hours, watching Jean Harlow and Greta Garbo, women who seemed to be in control, women whose pain was scripted, rehearsed, resolved. Norma Jeane memorized their movements, their glances, their walk, not because she wanted to act, but because she wanted to disappear. At 16, desperation made its final demand: marriage. Not out of love, but necessity. Her foster parents were moving away, and she faced another round of institutionalization. So she married a neighbor's son, James Doherty, hoping that being someone's wife might mean being someone at all. It didn't work. It never does. While her husband shipped off to war, Norma Jeane began working in a munitions factory. It was there, among the oil-slicked machines and rationed lunches, that a photographer noticed her. Noticed the cheekbones, the smile, the strange blend of innocence and danger. A pin-up career followed. Then studio contracts, then blonde dye, then voice coaching, then Marilyn Monroe. But the little girl never left. She haunted hotel rooms, whimpered in dressing rooms, hid behind pill bottles and prescription slips. The laughter in public became louder as the silence in private grew unbearable. Even her closest confidants described her as fragile, needy, hungry for affection. She wasn't just acting roles. She was seeking mothers, lovers, saviors in every co-star and every set. Because Norma Jeane had never learned to be alone without fearing she'd be left forever. Her journals reveal glimpses of that inner war, scribbled thoughts about being unworthy, about being broken, about fearing she was not real. At night, she sometimes called friends in a panic, unable to sleep, convinced that someone, something, was coming for her. And yet the world never saw that version, because trauma doesn't leave bruises when it's wrapped in satin. Because the camera only loves the mask. By the time she was 25, Marilyn Monroe was an icon, but Norma Jeane, the girl inside, was still peeking through the keyhole of other people's lives, hoping to be invited in. She didn't rise. She was sculpted. By studios, by men, by desperation, by dreams too fragile to survive in the daylight. Norma Jeane became Marilyn Monroe through 1,000 tiny compromises, one shade of blonde at a time, one octave lower in her voice, one breathier laugh, one tighter dress, one more rewrite of the truth. It started when 20th Century Fox signed her in the mid-1940s. The contract didn't just promise screen time, it required transformation. They lightened her hair, reshaped her eyebrows, changed her posture, renamed her mouth, and, finally, erased her name. Norma Jeane was too ordinary, too soft, too damaged, so she became Marilyn, a name borrowed from Broadway, and Monroe from her mother's maiden name. The reinvention was poetic, but poetry doesn't save lives. To become Marilyn, she had to die a little inside each day. They told her to smile more, to talk less, to flirt without trying, to never challenge a director, never question a line, and never, ever, reveal how smart she really was. Because Marilyn Monroe couldn't be clever, she had to be wanted. She studied everything: voice, posture, camera angles, lighting. She wasn't passive in her own creation. She co-designed her myth, but not from empowerment, from survival instinct. She knew what they wanted, and she became it so well that even she couldn't separate fact from fantasy. Studio executives saw her as currency. She was lent out to parties like a party favor, passed between powerful men with polished smiles and poisonous intentions. Rumors swirled, some true, some blurred, that she had affairs with moguls, producers, politicians. But it didn't matter. The myth absorbed it all. There was Joe DiMaggio, the baseball legend. He loved her, but hated Marilyn. He wanted the soft, shy girl at home, not the woman blowing kisses on red carpets. Their marriage dissolved under the weight of expectation, jealousy, and two very different versions of love. Then came Arthur Miller, the playwright, the intellectual. He saw through her image, or at least claimed to. For a time, Marilyn believed he loved her, not just the creation. But even he, eventually, wrote her pain into his plays and left her to drown in her own spotlight. She began to realize that even in intimacy, she was alone. Even in love, she was a projection. Hollywood, meanwhile, kept her in a loop. The sexy foil, the naive blonde, the sultry joke, and she resented it, deeply. She wanted real roles, dramas, substance, tragedy. But every time she tried to break out, the world shoved her back into the dress, the wig, the whisper. So she formed her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions. A bold move, unheard of, threatening. For a brief moment, she was no longer just a star, she was a force. But the resistance was brutal. Studios refused to cast her. Executives blackballed her quietly, and the press, once adoring, turned cold. They called her difficult, unreliable, emotional, words always used to punish women who stopped smiling. She was fighting for her own voice in a system that never wanted her to speak. And in doing so, she became an island, surrounded by admirers, but understood by none. By the late 1950s, Marilyn was at war with her identity. The woman she'd built had become her prison. She could no longer escape the performance, even when the cameras were off. The blonde curls were no longer costume. They were armor. And underneath, the girl with trembling hands was still pleading to be seen. But Hollywood doesn't make room for women who evolve. Only those who comply or collapse. And so Marilyn, the myth, continued to dazzle. While Norma Jeane, the woman, began to disappear. The cameras never blinked, even when she cried. By the late 1950s, Marilyn Monroe had conquered everything. She was the most photographed woman on the planet, the highest-paid actress in Hollywood, and the embodiment of American glamour. Her films drew millions. Her image sold products, dreams, and identities. Her very being was cultural capital. On magazine covers, she was an icon. On billboards, a goddess. On red carpets, a fantasy sculpted in silk and sequins. And yet, at the height of her power, Marilyn was unraveling. She struggled with insomnia so brutal that sleep became an enemy. She relied on a cocktail of pills, sleeping aids, amphetamines, tranquilizers, prescribed by doctors more interested in keeping her functional than keeping her whole. She would show up late to film sets, sometimes hours behind schedule. Not out of ego, but paralysis. Friends later described her morning routine as a war against dread. She feared being seen. She feared not being seen. The duality crushed her. Her body, the very currency of her fame, began to betray her. Years of emotional stress and medication left her physically weakened. She miscarried multiple times, each one deepening her wounds. The world expected her to be radiant. She was barely holding herself upright. And yet, she kept trying to break through. She starred in Bus Stop and The Misfits, roles that scratched at the surface of her emotional depth. She demanded, and earned, critical respect. But every step forward seemed followed by a shove back. Executives mocked her ambitions. Colleagues whispered that she was too emotional, too complicated. Even her triumphs were poisoned. At John F. Kennedy's birthday gala in 1962, she emerged in a sheer, glittering dress that clung to her like a second skin. She sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," in a whispery tone that electrified the audience. The moment became legendary. But behind the performance was a woman cracking. That night she was visibly frail, unstable, isolated. Rumors about her relationship with JFK, and possibly his brother Robert, swirled uncontrollably. Friends warned her that she was treading dangerous ground, that her proximity to power came with invisible shackles, that being Marilyn Monroe gave her access, but not protection. She was seen with men who could summon wars, but not one who could offer her peace. In private, she was writing poetry, keeping journals, speaking to psychiatrists, seeking the truth of who she was before the mirror told her otherwise. But Hollywood doesn't reward self-discovery. It punishes it. The media turned. Stories of meltdowns and erratic behavior filled columns. They didn't call her troubled out of concern, but entertainment. She became tabloid gold, her vulnerability monetized. And in a cruel twist, the more she tried to show her real self, the more the world devoured her illusion. The people who claimed to adore her, studios, fans, lovers, were the same ones who disappeared when she stopped smiling. And so she withdrew. In her final months, Marilyn was living in a house she never had time to decorate, surrounded by scripts she never got to read, haunted by phone calls she never got to return. Her relationships had frayed, her trust eroded. She was no longer the girl with stars in her eyes. She was the star who had seen too much darkness. And then, suddenly, she was gone. On August 5th, 1962, she was found dead in her Los Angeles home. Nude. Alone. A phone still in her hand. Official reports cited a barbiturate overdose. But conspiracy theories blossomed instantly. Some claimed suicide. Others, political cover-up. Some whispered about files, recordings, silenced calls. Her last words, if any, remain lost to time. What's undeniable is this. At the peak of her fame, she died more isolated than she had ever been. She had all the world's attention, but no one was listening. In the end, the world mourned the icon, but never truly knew the woman. News of Marilyn Monroe's death sent shockwaves through every continent. Photographers camped outside her home. Magazines printed tributes draped in black borders. Fans wept for the blonde bombshell, the fairy tale gone wrong. But even in death, she was stylized, filtered through the same lenses that had once adored her curves and now framed her coffin. Hollywood moved on, as it always does. But Marilyn never truly left. Her image became eternal. Her voice echoed in advertisements, biographies, bedroom posters, designer perfumes. Every actress labeled "The Next Monroe" was a tribute and a curse. Because what she left behind wasn't just a silhouette. It was a warning. A warning about the cost of beauty, the hunger for validation, the illusion of power in a world that only offers possession. Her diaries, later published, revealed a woman more intelligent, more self-aware, more human than anyone had dared imagine. Not the fragile toy of gossip columns, but a poet, a thinker, a prisoner aware of her own cell. Today, Marilyn Monroe remains a paradox. She is both dream and nightmare, icon and victim, a name that brings smiles and sighs in equal measure. But perhaps that's her true legacy. Not the legend she performed, but the pain she revealed. If only we had looked closely enough. She didn't vanish. She became a mirror. And we are still afraid to see what it reflects.